Today we're going to be talking about, the title of the lecture was Refugees in the Time of Globalization. I decided not to call it the refugee crisis because that is a problematic concept, a problematic phrase that we're going to tackle. It's a challenging topic, and it will be, the lecture really will be separated into two. It's hopefully I will get through the first half before we take the break. But we're really going to talk about a common history of where the concept of refugee comes from, the law that protects refugees, the history of it, and then tackle what has been called the refugee crisis in Europe, and then talk about how we in the United States have dealt with refugees and what our history is with refugee law. So it's really two separate stories of how from one source, which is really the creation of the Refugee Convention in 1951, Europe sort of went in one direction and we went into a parallel one with some different subtleties, okay? So I will begin. This is a picture from 1922. These are Greek refugees. They weren't called refugees at the time, who were forced to leave Turkey. And I want to start off with this story because it sets us up to understanding how it is that refugees are managed and treated and defined today, where the origin of all of this is. So in September 1922, in the city of Izmir in Turkey, was one of the sites of the most brutal episodes of forced migration in the 20th century. This happened in the context of the Greek-Turkish War, which was from 1919 to 1922. It was a very bloody and protracted conflict over Western Anatolia. And it was really that conflict that marked the end of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. But this wasn't the only conflict that had happened in the area. From 1912 to 1913, you had the Balkan Wars, you had the First World War, you have the Armenian Genocide, and a different group of related conflicts, and they all had to do with what would happen to the Ottoman Empire, what was called then the Eastern Question. The Greek-Turkish War capped this process and made the region even more unstable. By late 1922, the war had proven very costly for both sides, both the Greeks and the Turks. Atrocities had been committed by both armies, and much of the Anatolian hinterland had been razed to the ground. But Izmir really was where they had bet all their chips. This is where they were going to define their battle. Izmir was a vibrant and cosmopolitan city. It was pivotal to the political economy of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the centerpiece of both British-backed Greek occupation of Asia Minor and Soviet-supported Turkish nationalist drive to create a nation-state in the Ottoman Empire. So here we already see the presence of colonial powers moving the pieces as the Ottoman Empire is disintegrating. When Turkish troops seized Izmir from Greek forces in September of 1922, the city's Christian quarters were set on fire, and much of its Greek and Armenian populations were forced to flee. These movements were then formalized in a treaty that called for a compulsory exchange of minority populations between Greece and Turkey. So they take the city, they raze it to the ground, they expel the citizens, and then negotiate a treaty in which they agreed to exchange minority populations, right? As the conflict ended, the borders that were set included minority populations that were outside the borders that they had set. So they created a treaty in which they swapped populations. This is forced migration. right? And this created a precedent in which people, countries, politicians could not just define their boundaries through conflict or after conflict, but force populations out because of ethnic or religious identity to create a more homogeneous populace, right? The demographic composition of these countries was altered forever, and this exchange took place really from 1922 to 1934. Over 1 million Greeks and roughly 350,000 Muslims were uprooted from their homes. This was in 1922. Fast forward to today, Izmir is again the center of wide transit of migrants. Except now it's not because of a forced exchange, but really a criminal enterprise where traffickers and smugglers use Izmir as a center point to bring people into Europe. The Greek islands of Chios, Lesbos, and Samos lie just off the coast of Izmir. Refugees pay large sums of money to make the voyage to Europe. They do it on rafts, many which are poorly constructed and are highly unreliable. Local authorities are usually paid off to look the other way. Smugglers make a lot of money out of exploiting the refugees, and this drives a very remunerative black under the table economy in a country, Greece, where there is an economic crisis. So you have a situation where the European Union wants to constrain immigration. Every law that is passed furthers more this economy for smugglers. And while the Greek economy doesn't get better, they make more money out of exploiting the refugees. So you have this vicious circle in which any attempt to constrain immigration to Europe creates more of an incentive to break the law. That creates more of an incentive for smugglers to exploit these people, right? And the smugglers and the traffickers have absolutely zero care for the people that they are transporting. They couldn't care if they die or not in transit, because as long as they get paid, right? That's what counts, right? So this is really the setup for us. And the reason why I start here is because this crisis has been described, first of all, as a crisis, which I will argue against, and second of all, as unprecedented, that there have never been such transit of migrants in the world or refugees coming to Europe or coming around the world. And as we will see, the whole of the 20th century is one wave after another of refugees, displaced people, and migrants attempting to go where they will be safe. What changed was that in 1951, the world decided to codify how refugees are treated, and that's really sort of the axis for our conversation today. So, huge changes on the map, new countries appear. The boundaries did not coincide with the people, and you can sort of see it on the map, right? That there are lines that are outside of where the colors are, and this was the problem. That after World War I, aside from the Versailles Treaty and the punishment of Germany because they initiated the war, there were these ethnic groups that spoke different languages that were included in countries that either hadn't existed before or were beyond the boundaries. This really sets us up for World War II, which is a little bit outside the purview of our class, but this presence of these groups is important to understand why it is that we have this movement of displaced people and they become so crucial in the war. Yes, Walter?
Could you say again the time frame of those very significant changes of the political map?
from starting 1914 to 1917, I would say 1919. With the Ottoman Empire, it begins even before. 1913, 1914 were the Balkan Wars, so you begin really then. So you have World War I plus the death of the Ottoman Empire, plus the redrawing of the map in the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the colonial powers that redefined the boundaries. So you really have, in a period of 10 years, a complete redrawing of the map, also in Africa. So all of these redrawings have consequences for geopolitical power, but also for these ethnic groups. And for us, the more important one is that change in the map in Europe, because it leaves these groups that identified as being one ethnicity or one nationality, but were caught in the boundaries of a different state, right? So roughly 8 million subjects of the Russian Tsar were forced from their home during World War I, when the western borderlands of the Russian Empire fell into German and Austrian hands. Some fled for fear of occupation, but Germans, Jews, Poles, Latvians, and others were deliberately targeted by the Tsar as enemies within. Likewise, the conflict in the Balkans led to a refugee crisis as Muslims sought sanctuary in the Ottoman Empire. With their encounter with local Armenian population, this was going to have tragic consequences in 1915, when the Young Turks enlisted them in deporting Armenians en masse, murdering many civilians and condemning the remainder to death or penury in remote parts of Anatolia. This was but just one of the instances of forced migration that happened in the context of World War I. Some episodes, for example, the mass exodus of Serbians in 1915 following the Austrian invasion, were well known to the survivors and their descendants, but not really beyond their confines. No one paid attention in the international community to what happened to them. No one really remembers it except the survivors or the family of the survivors. So it's important to note again that mass population displacement happened not just because of war, but because politicians were trying to redefine the boundaries of their states and decided who would be part of that state and who wouldn't, okay? And we will see that this attention to displaced peoples has two big exceptions. One has to do with the Armenian genocide, which the League of Nations got involved in. And the other one has to do with the Russian Revolution, where you have displacement of people leaving Russia after the revolution and because of communism in the context of international affairs. So this is a quote from philosopher Hannah Arendt from her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. If a human being loses his political status, he should, according to the implications of the inborn and inalienable rights of man, come under exactly the situation for which the declarations of such general rights provided. But actually the opposite is the case. It seems that a man who is nothing but a man has lost the very qualities which make it possible for other people to treat him as fellow man. Hannah Arendt was exiled in 1933 from Germany. She was stripped of her German citizenship in 1937, later had to take flight from Vichy, France, finally reached New York in 1941. And in a lot of her writings, not just in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wondered how Europe and much of the world had betrayed many of the stateless people in her own time. And in that previous quote that I just read, she observed that it's citizenship that gives human beings the right to have rights. And once you take citizenship away from people, they become stateless. They seem to cease to be human beings in the eyes of the world. And it is when they most need it that they get treated the worst and that their rights disappear. So, the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the creation of the Refugee Convention in 1951, and then the European Convention of Human Rights in 1953 were supposed to address this problem that Hannah Arendt is talking about and to give the stateless citizens, the stateless people of the world, their rights. States who signed these documents, the states who became signatories to these conventions, who ratified these conventions, were not allowed to let stateless people die, as in the case of the Holocaust, or drown in front of their coasts, as it has been happening. And we're not supposed, most importantly, to send them back home where they were likely to be tortured or killed. They were entitled, most importantly, to a hearing to make their claim as being in dire danger, right? Anyone, in the words of the Refugee Convention, who fled a well-founded fear of being prosecuted had a right to claim refuge in any country that ratifies the convention. So the Convention of Human Rights, the Convention of Refugees in 1951, coupled with the Declaration of Human Rights, was created to give people the right to seek refuge in other countries. And those who signed these conventions were supposed to at least give these people a hearing. At a minimum, give people who were seeking refuge a hearing. Yes, Carl?
Did it matter whether the persecution was coming from a government or not?
In the context of when this happened, it was governments. And it was actually very narrow, as you will see in a minute. So we need to distinguish here between some concepts, which I'm going to do, and then we're going to go a little bit back and forth into history we're going to talk about today, and then go back in time a little bit. So a refugee is somebody who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, and violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are usually the leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. Asylum seekers are a little different from refugees. It's when people flee their own country and seek sanctuary in another country, and they apply for asylum. So a refugee flees their country and usually end up in a refugee camp. I'm gonna call it RC, okay? And an asylum seeker comes to a port of entry a border, could be a consulate, and asks for asylum. And it's once they're processed that they become refugees. But you're an asylum, you become a refugee if you're an asylum seeker, or you can be a refugee who gets processed through the UN Refugee Agency at a refugee camp, okay? The rules that set all of this out in very clear, distinct legal language is the 1951 Refugee Convention. It is the main international instrument that dictates how refugees should be treated. The convention clearly spells out who is a refugee, the kind of legal protections that they have to have, any assistance or social rights he or she should receive from the countries that have ratified the convention. The convention also defines what the refugees' obligations are to the host governments, and also defines a category of people who can never really be refugees. For example, war criminals who do not qualify for refugee status. And this is in answer to your question, Carl. The convention was limited at the time to protecting the European refugees in the aftermath of World War II. This convention was created because of what happened in World War II with the huge displacement of people, not just in the Holocaust, but through the war. the convention was expanded with the 1967 protocol, which expanded the scope of who would be covered by the Refugee Convention as displacement through decolonization or wars spread around the globe. So initially, the idea was to limit who would be covered by the Refugee Convention. And in a feat of naivete, they just assumed that it would be limited to Europe because it would never happen again. But then in 1967, they had to expand it. And really, this convention is what rules internationally how we think of refugees and how they get treated. This is, in green, all the countries that signed the 1951 convention. In yellow are the countries that signed after 1967. And in neon over there are ones that signed later in the 1970s. The countries in gray are the countries that have never signed the convention. Okay?
Why were we late?
We were late for reasons of our own immigration legal history, which I will address in the second half of the class. But it is very interesting that we sat down when the 1951 Convention on Refugees was drafted. We sat down and helped draft it. We contributed to the writing of it, but we never ratified it. At the moment, sorry. We never ratified it at the moment. Yes?
How does this relate to what happened to the Palestinians when they were displaced from what they owned?
Well, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, when the UN creates this convention, it creates quite a few organizations that are supposed to deal with refugees. They are the main agency that is to deal with refugees, and initially it was supposed to be a very narrow mission, but the institutions under the aegis of the UN begin to multiply and take on a coordination role that is very important. In the countries, this is also important, the countries where the convention isn't ratified, usually what you have are NGOs or civil society groups that fill in for what would be the UN, right? Which cannot be there because it hasn't been ratified, okay? I think it's important to keep these three distinctions in mind because they get blurred in all of the discussions. Refugees are different from immigrants. Immigrants usually come because they are escaping tough economic situation or some sort of climate catastrophe, an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that. That's not the case with refugees. Legally, they're defined by escaping a conflict zone and fearing for their lives, right? And in the context of what we're talking about, which is what was supposed to be called the crisis that happened in 2015, two things are important to keep in mind. In Europe, although most people think of the European Union as being one monolith, each country, each state has different immigration law and assess asylum claims in different ways. This is not uniform. Each country has national sovereignty over how they deal with refugees. But there is also something called the Dublin Treaty, which means that whatever is the first country of entry for an asylum claimant in the European Union, they are the ones who process the asylum claim. And why does this matter? Because the entry point for most of the refugees who are coming in the last 6 or 7 years have been the countries in the south of Europe which are the problems who have the biggest economic difficulties, and who have a coast that makes them attractive for the traffickers. It also means that once they file there, they're supposed to stay there until their claims are adjudicated. And most of these refugees are either looking for their families who are in other parts of Europe, or want to go to other parts of Europe where there are better job prospects, right? So in the context of the immediate cause of what is called the refugee crisis of Europe of 2015, 2016, was the civil war in Syria, which left 22 million Syrians in a vulnerable position. It was also compounded by breakdown of authority in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Eritrea. As a result, desperate people started fleeing in even larger numbers during the past 2 or 3 years. For a few years now, the Syrian refugees have been mainly going to neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. There is a misconception that all of the people who are coming to Europe are all of the refugees that have left Syria, and that is not correct. Most of the refugees are in Turkey, are in Jordan, or in Lebanon, right? And the only reason that they decided to leave, so for example, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees registered more than 4 million Syrian refugees. More than 1 million are in Lebanon, in a country that has a population of 4 million, right? And more than 2 million refugees are in Turkey. As the Syrian conflict intensified in 2014 and 2015, these refugees, because these refugee camps were so populated, they weren't able to find employment, lawful employment, decent housing, or even establish any kind of legal residence, either in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey. And they needed to look elsewhere to settle. The Arab states in the Gulf refuse entry to refugees from the area. So the only possible destination was Europe. From Turkey, Bulgaria is the closest entry point to Europe. It's a 2-hour trip by car or bus from Istanbul. And from there, arrivals can apply for asylum in this EU member state or continue to another country. Syrian refugees generally don't want to stay in Bulgaria, though, because it's a country of 7 million. And because it has a very small economy, the conditions for refugees in Bulgaria are not very good. The likelihood that they will find employment there are also not very good. An even more powerful deterrent, though, was that the Bulgarians decided to build a fence of barbed wire. And of course, the excuse or the reason for it was that they were trying to stop human traffickers from Turkey. As many people noted at the time, in a country where nothing gets built quickly, the fence was built almost overnight. It is because of the risk of this impenetrable Bulgarian fence that refugees then began to take the risk of doing the trip by sea, right? In rickety boats from Izmir, Turkey, to nearby Greek islands. Yet most refugees attempt to leave Greece as soon as they arrive because of high unemployment rate, which was 50% for young people. There are very few economic resources, plus very strict residency and citizenship laws. So most new refugees arriving in Greece want to go to Germany, Austria, Sweden, or Norway, Western European states that have liberal migration laws, plus plenty of employment and social benefits. Yes?
Does the European Union give money to those countries who will really
That's the problem, which we're going to get to. That has been the whole discussion. So to arrive, so if you're crossing either from, let's say, either from Bulgaria when you could, or from Greece, you have to go through the Balkans to get to the countries in Northern Europe where they want to go. And these are conflict-ridden states. Over the summer of 2015, there were chaotic scenes of refugees waiting at train stations in Macedonia or sleeping in tents in downtown Belgrade, Serbia. There was also a standoff between Croatia and Serbia on the issue of refugees, which reminds us that the wounds of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s are still present. When crossing into Croatia, the refugees also had to be careful not to step on landmines that were left over from the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. And it was clear that as these refugees were trying to make their way to countries in Northern Europe, people from Kosovo, Albania, and Bosnia were actually joining these refugees to try and come in with them to Austria and Germany. This development prompted Germany to declare that Western Balkans were a safe area, meaning that they did not qualify as refugees, and that if they claimed to be refugees, anybody who was coming from the Balkans would be turned back. Syrian and other recent refugees did not fare better in the rest of, in other countries in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland. And of course, the place where the situation was most dramatic was in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is the leader of the far-right nationalist party Fidesz, adopted a very uncompromising anti-refugee position. Hungary emerged as a desired destination for the refugees because it is a member of the Schengen zone, which does not require passport controls and border posts between countries. Nonetheless, they too began to build a fence. So because of the problem in Hungary, most of the refugees ended up going to Slovenia, which is a small country of barely 2 million, whose government has had to deal with as many as 15,000 refugees crossing into the country daily. Its government threatened to close its border off should Austria and Germany not speed up the transfer of refugees along the way. So, yes?
Does the UN Refugee Agency have any position on keeping refugees in concentration camps, if you will, indefinitely?
Refugee camps. I mean, once you have to, the process that you have to go through, and we'll see in a video later, all the steps you have to go through to get vetted through the UN. The processes can vary from 2 to 5 years. So if you come to a refugee camp and sign up to be designated as a refugee there, you have to wait to go through the process, which is a legal, very thorough, established process, and then you apply to go to certain countries. And once they get cleared, just a second, once they get cleared, they can go. A lot of people don't even attempt to go into a refugee camp, right? Because it feels like a hole out of which they're never gonna get out. So they attempt to do it this other way, which is either to be smuggled or try and reach a country where they know they have more likelihood to have a claim of asylum accepted instead of going through the refugee camp route. For some people, for you to be able to go through this route of having to pay a smuggler, you have to have the money, right? To be able to do it. Some of the pieces that I put on the folder for you guys from the New York Review of Books are very thorough, describing what it is like to be a refugee on this path, how much you pay, who you pay, how you get exploited or not exploited. It's disturbing and graphic, but these people are trying not to die. So you understand that this is why they do it. In general, once you put a refugee claim in a refugee camp, most people bet that they'll be able to get out of there. But not everybody puts a claim. Some people are just in the refugee camp waiting for something to happen, and some people end up living for decades in refugee camps, right? Yes, and then Walter.
Yes, my question is, all that is well take responsibility or sanction these countries that allow their people, meaning, okay, a government is, whatever they're doing, that they cannot handle their countries or take care of the people,
Well-
or having all these wars allowing them
Well, I
to
mean,
leave
the
wars.
UN doesn't have a mandate to stop wars, and even when they have been in Sudan or in the 1990s in the Balkan Wars, where the UN tried to be a force for good, they ended up being witnesses to the biggest ethnic cleansing that happened in Europe since the Holocaust. So it is very difficult for an organization like the UN to stop people from going to war. The UN, the only thing that they can do in this case is protect the refugees. They cannot tell countries what to do. That's not their role in the world. The UN High Council for Refugees does work that other organizations refuse to do. They run the camps, they get financing for the camps, they coordinate in humanitarian situations, even when it's not a situation of refugees, like when the earthquake in Haiti, they volunteered to run the camps for the people who didn't have where to live. So the UN is stepping in the humanitarian sense and the processing of the claims, but they cannot determine what's happening in conflict zones. I mean, they're not, unless a country decides to go and stop the war, and even then, that probably won't stop the war, right? There is a civil war going on in Syria. That civil war has been going on since 2011, 2012. It's still going on, but the level of refugees coming into Europe has decreased, right? This crisis that I'm talking about was really 4 months in the summer of 2015. The refugees are still coming, but this sense that Europe was being overrun by a number of displaced people never seen in the history of the world, in reality, at the same time that was happening, there were refugee crises happening all over the world, and they didn't get any attention, right? Yes, Walter, you had a question.
My question is a flip of the first question, and that is, where is the authority and the responsibility of the UN High Commission for Refugees contrasted with the sovereignty of the nation that has the port of entry?
The port of entry, whatever nation is the port of entry, they decide, right?
Supposedly in alignment with the
If
commission.
they are signatories to the convention in 1951, these countries have 2 obligations: to hear the claim, right? To accept the claim, to hear the claim, and to not send the claimant back to the country they run away from, right? The UN can only do 2 things. It can make sure that people are not being sent back to the country where they're going to be killed, are forced to get back to the country where they're going to be killed. And if these countries are signatories to the Refugee Convention, to make sure that the people get a hearing. But again, the UN Refugee Agency doesn't have a very efficient enforcement mechanism, and this is the problem at the EU level, that each country, we tend to think of the EU as one monolith, and it's not a monolith. Each country has its own policy, which sort of goes against the idea of Schengen, where everybody's supposed to be able to go through. So they sort of rub against each other in a way. Yes?
There are countries that are open to refugees, like Brazil, that has lots of land to develop.
Brazil right now is dealing with a huge wave of refugees from Venezuela, so is Colombia. At the height of the wave of refugees about a year and a half ago, I mean, it's still today, it's happening, but there was a moment, I want to say a summer and a half ago, where they closed their border because of the amount of people that was trickling into their country. I mean, again, there is, when we know that there are people dying of hunger in Venezuela, you want them to have the option of going to a place where they can eat. But at the same time, you can understand why Brazil would say, well, we have accepted 500,000 refugees in the last 2 months, enough, right? But again, if you're a signatory, you are bound to at least have a hearing. The question is, where does the refugee camp get established? Does the UN get involved? Does the country call on the UN to get involved to help them, right? Because once the UN gets involved and they create the refugee camp, it is the responsibility of the UN High Commission on Refugees to feed, clothe, and do all they have to do for the refugees. It stops being the issue of the country. Yes, and then I think there was another question.
Look at this, a subset of refugees, those who are seeking asylum and who have, fortunately, have the documentation to justify their asylum. Say an edict from the government that their head is on the chopping block, for example, just to sort of be a little dramatic. But do they get preference still over refugees in general?
I mean, again, it depends on the country. Yeah. Each country has a different policy. When you arrive at the port of entry, you have to sign all the paperwork. At least, for example, here, you are giving a form that is, I think, 48 pages, if I'm not mistaken. The form is in English. It has to be filled out in English. Most of the people who are asking for asylum here don't speak English, and usually do not have the economic resources to hire a lawyer to help them fill out the form. A lot of the people, as you note, don't have documentation. The idea is that you present a claim, and it is the responsibility of the government to which you presented the claim to investigate the claim and to make an effort to investigate the claim, right? I do know that until recently here, the process had been you present yourself at the port of entry, you file your claim, you are monitored, you're giving an ankle monitor, or you are released into the country until it's investigated. People who claim asylum want to be here because they're terrified, or whatever country they're going to. In immigration in general, but it's also true with refugees, people go where they know there are other people from their own country, or there are communities that are already established. So a lot of people who come that are coming from the Middle East to Europe are going to people from their village they know are in a certain, a certain part of Sweden, right? So they end up all going more or less where they know that they will have a support network, they have family members. The question is, who gets priority? I know that in the United States, for example, because it's the case that I know the best, before we signed or created our own Refugee Act in 1980, people fleeing communist countries got priority, right? Our definition, the United States definition of who was a refugee, although we had signed the protocol in 1967, which is supposed to be non-ideological, the American definition of who was a refugee is somebody who's running away from a communist government. Because our definition of refugee was linked to foreign policy. It was instrumentalist. That created a legal problem because you ratified a convention that says exactly the opposite of what you were doing. So that had to be squared away, and that's why the United States created the Refugee Act of 1980. You're not supposed to give priority to people. I am sure that if you are Salman Rushdie, right, and you know that somebody put a contract on you, that person, because they're known, they will get processed much quicker than anybody else. I mean, there is a case of somebody that I know that I've known for about 20 years. They've been here for about 20 years. They were here under TPS, the temporary protector status from El Salvador connected to the Central American Wars, and has made a life here for herself. Her son got killed by MS-13, targeted by MS-13 in El Salvador. She cannot go back to El Salvador because her family is the target of MS-13. But TPS is over now. So ideally, she actually has a letter from the Salvadorian consulate that says this person cannot be returned to El Salvador because she will die. But I do not know that that will make a difference anymore, because everything is so up in the air and arbitrary right now that I do not know that that will be honored or not, right? Yes, and then in the back.
What is the port of entry? Because I see that a number of people are being sent back out and told, come through the port of entry and not through
The port of entry, for many years in US law, port of entry was a consulate. So for example, during World War II, when Jews were trying to come to the United States, because we were under quota law, right, since 1921, 1924, and the quotas were created on the basis of how many people of that nationality had existed in 1880. That was the formula of the quotas. We'll talk about that in a minute. So there was a huge number of available immigration spots, even during the quota period for Germans. A lot of the Jews trying to run away from the slaughter of the Nazis were Germans. But the port of entry wasn't here. The port of entry was the consulate. And under Hoover, they used a little formula called liability to become a public charge, which meant that if you were likely to not be able to sustain yourself, or if you had been ill, ever been in a hospital, had a mental illness, had a disability, you were deemed a liability to become a public charge. And the order during the Hoover administration to the consular officers was, you use the strictest definition of liability to become a public charge, and that way people were not allowed in. The quotas for Germany during World War II went unused, mostly. And it depended on who was the consul at the port of entry. The idea of moving the port of entry away from the United States was part of the quota system. That changed. The port of entry now is the border, where there is an immigration agent.
But people who get to the border
Are being told that there's no aside, that they cannot present the claim, yes.
They're told to go to the port of entry.
No, they are at the port of entry, and they are being told that they cannot claim asylum. That's what they're being told. The people who are being told to go to the port of entry are people who are trying to cross the border illegally, because they have been told that there is no ability to claim asylum at the port of entry, right? But we'll return to that. Yeah, sorry, in the back.
I was wondering about food and medical. You say UN, if the UN is present, then they can do that.
They are,
But-
yeah, they're
but
the
my
ones.
question
They're the ones who are in charge. Yes.
My question is, in transit or other host countries will accept some. They presumably have, I guess if it's willing to host some, do they have to provide medical, or is it up to them for you to do food and medical?
I mean, it depends. As I was saying, in Bulgaria, the transit camps are, they have very meager resources. So
So people are largely dependent on their money? Which would be in
again,
their
most
host
of the
country.
people who are able to make the trip have already paid through the nose through the smugglers, right? They're lucky if they have any money left. I actually, in one of the articles in the New York Review of Books or in the New Yorker, it says that some families are actually They don't even bring money because they rely on other refugees to pay for them, and they help each other that way as they're crossing. Again, once the UN Refugee High Council is involved, they are the ones who run the refugee camps. In Europe, each country runs their transit camps or their port of entry. In general, Austria and Germany have been the countries where refugees are treated in the most generous way. And of course, this was and continues to be the issue, right? Somebody else asked, I think it was you, about if other countries give to the countries that become the port of entry, and that becomes an issue. Yes, Carl?
Does the UN ever declare a situation to be genocide? And if so, would that make it easy for a member of the group, the victim group, to get refugee status?
Well, the Rohingya were declared to be suffering from from a genocide, and they are, yes, by the UN Commission, and they are in camps, and they are refugees in refugee camps, but that doesn't guarantee that they will be accepted. I mean, it really, I mean, this is an issue of national sovereignty. Each claimant has to be processed individually. It's not done in a mass way, right? And that is why it takes so long.
But the definition is being singled out for racial or
yes,
religious
and it's supposed, having that being defined by the UN Commission on Refugees should help, but it doesn't guarantee that the country that will, I mean, again, the UN has no enforcement mechanism. All they can do is help process the refugee and vet them through the process of becoming a certified refugee for resettlement. And that's what they do. They take care of the refugee camps, they do the vetting, but they're not the ones in charge of determining at port of entry an asylum claim, because that relies on the sovereignty of the signatories. That's why these countries ratified the convention, right? Because they said, we will obey the law of this convention. And according to what you just asked, they should. Yes, Linda?
Just a point of definition of terms. One of the terms was when someone's at war, country's at war. So if I remember correctly, Jeff Sessions said having gangs that you're running from is not war.
Yes, that has become a problem. And if you allow me to put it in a box for when we speak about what is happening now in about 40 minutes, because again, this issue of refugees sort of bifurcates into two different problems, if you want to define it that way. One is the problem of the European Union not being able to manage their cooperation between states, having created an area where there were no borders, right? As jumping off from the question that Walter asked a little while ago, you have two forces working against each other or in conflict with each other. The creation of the Schengen area, where you have no borders and no enforcement mechanism for borders, because that's what they planned, in confrontation with a wave of refugees who are escaping. And all of these countries are signatories to the Convention of Refugees from 1951, so they have to process them, right? And as I said before, you cannot send them back to the country of entry. So one of the things that they have done, and precisely why the smuggling and the trafficking is such a problem, because it creates this vicious circle, is that the European Union signed a deal with Turkey that those who were deemed irregular migrants or not refugee material could be sent back to Turkey. So in the refugee camps, in Turkey, you also have people who attempted to go to Europe and were returned to Turkey because they were not deemed to qualify, right? And the way they get around that thing of not being sent to the country where they're going to kill you is to send you to Turkey. right? But that doesn't solve the issue because most of the people who are in Turkey want to get out of Turkey. And also Turkey doesn't want the refugee camps to grow more. So it becomes this unsolvable problem, which became a flashpoint during this period in the summer of 2015. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Most people, when they said that this crisis was unprecedented, are taking a historical view because, as I said, there was previously, and I'm not even going back 50 years to the Holocaust, right, or World War II, there was a refugee crisis that had religious tinged ethnic problems at the center of it, and in which Europe had to deal with waves and waves and waves of refugees. So the Yugoslav war in the 1990s was the largest forced migration in Europe after World War II, with some 2.7 million internally displaced persons and refugees. Many of those Yugoslav war refugees were offered temporary humanitarian shelter elsewhere in Europe under circumstances that are very similar to those of the Syrian refugees today. Many returned to Bosnia and other former Yugoslav areas after the war, but still others permanently settled in Western Europe and the United States. And in another parallel to today, it was Germany and Austria that accepted the largest number of refugees in the 1990s. So now we're going to get whiplash and talk about the United States. And this is probably one of my favorite ceremonies. I got naturalized, and it was one of the most touching moments of important moments of my life. But I love seeing the ceremonies of the service members who get naturalized as Americans after serving. So, to talk about how the United States reacted or complied with the creation of the Refugee Convention, we have to talk about what happened before and put refugee law into the history of immigration law in the United States. And really, until the end of the 19th century, except for a few episodic moments in the 18th century and some in the middle of the 19th century, immigration to this country was open and free. Everybody could come, as long as, even during colonial times, if somebody paid for you to come here and work, you could come and work and then stay. All of this really begins to change at the end of the 19th century. It changes for a variety of reasons, mostly because of scientific theories that were popular at the time, that claimed that intelligence and other personal traits were inherited, not just individually, but as racial characteristics. So at the end of the 19th century, the United States creates what would be an immigration service that would limit immigration. We have the Chinese exclusion, which was the first law that limited immigration in some way. Also, during this period, although I didn't mention it here, women who married non-citizens lost their citizenship. I don't know if you guys know this. Yes.
How about men who married non-citizens?
No, didn't work that. Didn't work that way. That didn't. Yes, all of you are looking at me agog. Yes. I teach a whole course on the history of U.S. immigration. It's fascinating. But so this sort of beginnings of restriction that happened at the end of the 19th century turns into a whole movement towards restriction in 1921 and 1924, where immigration was determined by national origins, right? And it was a system that was enacted to keep out what were described in the legislative records as the innately inferior new immigrants of Eastern and Southern Europe. There is an interesting wrinkle when this nativist movement really begins at the end of the 19th century. The thing that nativists thought would be the death of immigration to the United States would be a literacy test. So starting at the end of the 19th century, they started pushing both Congress and the President of the United States to pass a literacy test. What is interesting is it wasn't an English literacy test. It was a literacy test in your own language. So you had to be able to read and write in your own language. This never really caught on. By the time it catches on is in 1917, when Wilson enacts it at the Cabot Lodge was one of the senators who was behind this. But by the time it is enacted, the literacy issue was not the solution anymore, because the countries that these people were coming from had caught up on the literacy issue. So they had to create a different formula. And what they came up with was this national origins, right? So what it did was limit annual immigration of any given nationality to 3% of the number of such persons that were already in the United States in 1890. They chose the census year so they would get a formula that would create quotas that were huge for Northern Europeans and zero for everybody else, right? So the purpose of the new law was to preserve a fading Northern and Western European character of the US population. So Great Britain, for example, has 2% of the world population, but received 43% of the quota. So it was with, oh, and another thing that is interesting, because the focus of the quota system was on the seedy European immigrants, right? You know who was not part of the quota system? Latin America. Mexicans weren't part of the quota system.
They could come.
Yes, there was no quota for anybody in the hemisphere. So the quota system focused on Europe and ignored the continent, our continent. Fast forward 100 years, and now the obsession is our continent. I mean, it's it really is like trying to play catch up with the unintended consequences of the law that you first created to keep people out, that creates another group that comes that then becomes the group that you want to keep out, right? So, yes?
1890, there's a sizable population of people who descended from Africa. Were they admitted? No, not some.
No, because we are talking about, yes.
Did I miss something, or it's just
Well,
an
I mean,
assumption?
it's just after the Civil War, Reconstruction had stopped and Jim Crow has started. So obviously, I mean, these racial theories that were very popular did not include counting the African American population.
Specified?
It wasn't specified, but I mean, the formula just didn't have them in it, right? The formula was created so the two countries that had the biggest quotas were Germany and England. Yes?
Yeah, well, in the census of 1890, black African Americans weren't even counted, were they?
I don't think so.
They-
Yeah.
I mean, they counted.
I mean,
They counted men because they could vote. It was for representation in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't they just count land?
yeah, and also we should note that historians who had looked at how the formula was created, right? There was a debate at the time about which census year to use. And some people were saying to use 1910, I think, but they went back to this 19th century number. But even using that number, the projections of how much of the population was from each country was completely invented because they really couldn't pin it down. Again, in the 19th century, Germany didn't even exist. It was Prussia, right? So how did they decide who came from where? Sometimes they tried to do it with language. All of this was really just an excuse to make the quota slant, right? To re-engineer backwards the type of population that they wanted. And who were they trying to keep out? Italians, Jews, right? Irish. So the quotas were created in a very specific way. But again, to get back to what I was saying before, it was very pernicious because during World War II, when the quotas were huge for Germans, they went unused. And you couldn't transfer them to other people. There were attempts to have the Immigration Service transfer those quota numbers to other people so that they could be saved from the war, and they were not allowed because the quotas were not transferable. Yes?
Isn't that sort of like today when it's recommended by some people to other people that they try to maintain their status as a people of a certain national group? Hasn't that been recommended by Trump to the Germans? That you're going to
well, I
go
mean,
there? Isn't that the same idea?
there is. I'll jump to that at the end of the class. Let's focus and get to this, because we're running out of time again. So it is possible to characterize this 1924 Act as the Anti-Refugee Act, the first Anti-Refugee Act. Why? Because there had been stories of new waves of pogroms happening in Russia, and fear of a flood of Jewish immigrants was the immediate catalyst for the passing of the 1924 Act. This restrictionist tradition remained dominant even throughout the period of the rise of Hitler and ensuing World War II. Few Jews who managed to escape Germany in the early years of Nazism succeeded coming to the United States. If you read the chapters from the Daniels book that I sent, Guarding the Golden Door and the other one, there are these harrowing descriptions of people who had jobs here, who I think one was a man who either was a philosopher or a musicologist, I can't remember. But because he was Jewish and the organization where he taught was Jewish, the Nazis had downgraded his institution to not be a university anymore. And even though he had a sponsor for work, he was not allowed to come because of liability to become a public charge. Because his university, his educational institution, they honored the classification of the Nazis of his educational institution, and that's why he wasn't able to come in. And Daniel names many stories. And these were people who had paperwork, had everything. It sort of goes to Terry's question from before. They should have been given priority because they had the paperwork, which most people at that time didn't have, but they were not allowed in. Again, because the port of entry was outside. Although at first Hitler allowed Jews to leave but prohibited them from bringing assets with them, President Hoover instructed U.S. consuls to apply stringently the clause excluding those likely to become public charges. And if you read what is happening in immigration, the changes in immigration law today, you will hear this a lot. There is a push now to go back to this definition of liability to become a public charge from the 1920s. It has already been written as a regulation. It hasn't been approved, but it's already been written. President Roosevelt later revoked this order, but few Jewish refugees ever succeeded in gaining entrance to the United States. We could talk about what happened with the St. Louis, but as William Bernard has described in his excellent article, A History of U.S. Immigration Policy, in the years between 1933 in 1944, fewer than 250,000 refugees were admitted to the United States, and mostly as legal exceptions outside the formal immigration quotas. In that decade, popularly characterized as the time of refugee immigration, the nation in fact received the smallest influx of newcomers since the 1830s. For the first time in its history, the number of people leaving the United States exceeded the number entering. After the war, the traditional ambivalence in US immigration policy continued, but it took a new form as a result of two more or less simultaneous historical phenomena. The first was the experience of the Holocaust, which attempted and nearly succeeded in achieving the annihilation of a people because of their religious and ethnic origins. International outrage in its aftermath spurred the development of the norms that I spoke about before, Human Rights Convention, plus the Convention on Refugees 1951 as the legal instruments to prevent that. And secondly, the United States was now a world power, and it was dedicated in large part to the containment of communism. So a more instrumentalist view of immigration and refugees was applied. The idea was that welcoming refugees from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, United States foreign policy makers could evoke a national historic mission as a heaven for freedom-loving peoples. The older conflict between a cosmopolitan ideal of nationality and nativist restrictionism shifted when new tensions came into play. On the one hand, refugee policy conceived as a means of safeguarding human rights, and on the other, refugee policy as an instrument of foreign policy, right? So the Cold War, not only was there a consequence of what happens in the war and how these people were treated when they were trying to flee for their lives, but also the United States had a new mission in the world, which is anti-communist, which is why the definition of refugee and communism gets melded in America in a way that it doesn't get melded anywhere else. So after the war, the concept of refugee developed into a distinct formal category in the United States law. But this tension between humanitarian instincts and instrumentalist instincts continued. So the United States, as I said, participated in the drafting of the convention in '51, but didn't sign it. The country instead passed a series of laws allowing for the admission of limited categories of refugees, but as exceptions to the quota system. The quota system continued to exist, and the category of refugee was accepted, but only as an exception. Displaced persons from refugee camps in Europe were admitted as part of a broader policy of assisting in the political and social stabilization of our Western allies in Europe. Later, the Refugee Relief Act of '53 provided for the expedited admission of refugees fleeing communist-dominated countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. This was limited and ad hoc and resulted because of a tension between the executive branch and Congress. Congress was still in the framework of the quota system, of restrictionism. It was willing to make limited exceptions from this general approach for those who escaped communism, but the instinct in Congress was to continue to limit how many people came into the United States, including refugees. Congress refused to enact any permanent quota or to create any binding, ongoing legislative commitment for refugees. Instead, the Displaced Person Act of 1948 created technical cutoff dates which precluded the issuance, repetition there, of substantial number of visas for persons who had fled fascist oppression, particularly Jews and other Eastern Europeans, indelicately referring to them in some legislative records as racial out. The executive, well,
Italians escaping fascism. It was still too dark.
The executive branch, on the other hand, was actually embarrassed by the national origin system and was particularly concerned with the foreign policy implications and possibilities of refugee admissions. When the national origin system was enacted into law again in 1952, President Truman condemned it as a slur to many of our new NATO allies who were protecting we were protecting ourselves from immigrants from Eastern Europe when we should be giving them asylum, because this had been the people who had been mistreated and exploited and targeted during World War II. The executive branch was more liberal in its outlook, so it fought for and achieved unfettered autonomy in deciding the number of types of refugee admissions. And how did they do this? Through parole power. They were able to parole people. If you had ever been an immigrant like me, you are given a parole, you apply to become an American citizen, and you're not supposed to be able to travel. And instead, if you need to travel for an emergency, they give you a little paper that's called a parole, which it's bizarre. But anyway, that parole power admitted group of refugees. It gave the executive branch the ability to admit refugees when Congress wouldn't do anything about it. The parole power had been designed originally as an exception to normal immigration process, only for emergent humanitarian reasons. The parole power became the major vehicle for refugee admissions until 1980, when we created the Refugee Act. It was used first for Hungarians fleeing from Soviet oppression in 1956. Then it was used for Cubans in the 1960s and 1970s, and then for Russian Jews and Indo-Chinese in the 1970s. Literally hundreds of thousands of refugees were admitted under this parole power. Congress mostly complained about the fact that the executive branch was creating all these new categories of refugees without any oversight for them. But all of this happens in the context of the 1960s becoming a more liberal, the congressional branch becoming more liberal in terms of immigration. In 1965, we do away with the quota system and create what is the bulwark of, until recently, the bulwark of our immigration system, which is family unification. That you want immigrants to be with their families, that families together, immigrating together, are the best resource for the United States. So family unification was the basis on which the system, it wasn't any longer about countries, it was about family unification. They also created the lottery, right? I don't know if you heard that podcast from This American Life, the golden ticket, created the lottery, which brought a diversity of people from all over the world to the United States. A permanent refugee quota was actually enacted after 1965, although this new seventh preference was limited numerically and defined refugee exclusively as somebody who was running away from a communist country. Again, if you were in a country where there was a war but there wasn't a communist, you weren't a refugee, according to this, right? The provision in earlier law allowing an alien in a deportation proceeding to have his or her deportation withheld based on a persecution claim was changed, eliminating the stringent requirement of actual physical prosecution. They began to loosen how strictly they looked at refugee law internationally to allow people to come in as refugees. And as I said, in '68, we ratified the Protocol of 1967, but that created a problem, right? Because we were accepting refugees based on ideological persecution having to do with communism, and the '67 Protocol said you couldn't do that. So all of this finally got resolved when in 1980, the Refugee Act was passed. Part of what pushed the Refugee Act to happen was the arrival of boat people from Haiti, refugees from Haiti, the Mariel boat lift. All of this had to do with the passing of the Refugee Act, lawsuits that were brought for due process for these applicants as refugees. And once the Refugee Act is passed in 1980, it has been further refined through litigation as to what consists to be persecuted or not. Regarding the question that somebody asked before, that litigation included, until 2016, people who were, like my friend, persecuted by gangs. So my Salvadorian friend who cannot go back to El Salvador, which is no longer experiencing a war, but whose son was targeted by MS-13 to die, and she is targeted. She cannot go back according to how the law had proceeded until 2016, right? She was not allowed to be sent back to the country where she would be targeted, right? Yes?
We think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, and yet all of this is the history of what?
This concept of us being a nation of immigrants is we want to think we're a nation of immigrants, but actually, nope. We actually are not very welcoming. If you look at the numbers of how waves of immigrants that have come to the country, I'm going to go back one more. In October 2016, Gallup asked this question of Americans. 54% of registered voters said the U.S. does not have a responsibility to accept refugees from Syria, while 41% said that it does. But if you, and we like to think when we hear a number like that, you hear this a lot these days, it's not who we are. We are a nation of immigrants. We welcome immigrants. We welcome refugees. Actually, we usually don't. Hungarians, would you approve or disapprove of a plan to permit this is 1958, and by the way, they were running away from the communists. In 1958, would you disapprove of a plan to permit 65,000 refugees who escaped communism, Hungary, to come to the United States? 55% disapprove. Indochinese in 1979, disapprove, 62%. Cubans in 1970, 71%. Ethnic Albanians, ooh, that changed. Several hundred ethnic Albanian refugees from Kosovo have been brought to the U.S. Do you support or oppose the decision to bring them here? I guess in 1999, the better angels of our nature. Right, exactly. Or the fact that they were just a few hundred instead of 65,000. But again, I mean, this concept of us being a nation of immigrants, we want to be a nation of immigrants, but then when we're confronted with the immigrants, we don't necessarily want to be a nation of immigrants. And there is a tendency for a group that is discriminated against in one generation to be completely assimilated and then discriminate against the group that comes behind them, right? Because we become more American than the next American, and as Americans, we're going to discriminate against those who come behind us. Yes?
I'm an immigrant.
Yes.
And I waited my turn.
Mm-hmm.
I came here legally. What happened to that's the difference.
But sorry, we're not talking about illegal immigration. We're talking about refugees. We're not.
Okay,
Our discussion right now is not. I don't want to get out of the box of what we're discussing right now.
What you said, we are a nation of right.
Yeah.
So that's why I brought it up.
Yeah. No,
Yes.
but that is not the discussion that we're having today.
Okay.
Because once we begin to have this back and forth about who comes here legally, who doesn't come here legally, our discussion today is about refugees.
Okay.
And how refugee law that we signed, international law, plus law that we created about refugees, how we accept or not refugees. These numbers that I showed are not about these are not numbers about illegal immigration.
No, it's when you say nation of immigrants.
No.
That's why I brought it up.
Right.
Yeah.
We can revisit that topic in the history of U.S. immigration next semester. But when we look at these numbers, right, this is not even about legal or illegal immigration. This is about refugees, right? And even when we're talking about refugees, people who we as a government invited to come here because of our legal obligations under the 1967 protocol and our 1980 Refugee Act, we still do not support it. Because the popularity of accepting refugees, it's never popular, right? One issue is what is popular and one issue is what is morally right. And when you begin to poll things that fall in moral categories, usually you're not gonna get a good polling number. Nevertheless, these people came here and assimilated into our country. They were welcomed into our country. And if you look at the numbers of how people acclimate or become, how Americans they become, the fear of each generation that refugees will not become American have proven unfounded because they all integrate into being Americans. Yes, Linda?
I'm not to play psychologist, but I think when you're first...
If you can speak up because I can't hear you.
Not to be a psychologist, but from a teaching perspective, when you're a new immigrant and you become acclimated enough that people are accepting you, there's always a fear that if there are more that come, it will be obvious that you're not quite an American yet, and it will raise the specter of non-acceptance, because you're tenuous. First
Yes,
generation, you're
that
tenuous.
is probably part of it.
Doesn't make it right.
No, that is probably right. I mean, again, the United States has all these tools that it has created historically for creatively dealing with refugee law, and to smuggle non-refugees under refugee guises. So, for example, the United States was very involved in Central America because of the Cold War, in the wars of the 1980s. And because there were huge numbers of people who were displaced during the 1980s, but they weren't exactly running away from communist regimes, they couldn't really be accepted necessarily as refugees, we created a system called TPS, temporarily, right. So there are people who have been here under TPS for 30 years. Also, when Hurricane Mitch happened in the 1990s, that brought a huge wave of refugees from Mitch who were given TPS status, right? It's supposed to be temporary by definition, but just like the parole was used during the quota system to smuggle people in a way, legally, right, into a system that couldn't adapt or conform because it couldn't be reformed legally at the time. So the government found a way of extending the status of refugees to people that they felt responsible for because of the wars, right, of the 1980s in which we participated. In general, if we look at, here we go. Historically, the total number of refugees coming to the United States has fluctuated depending on the crisis that is happening at the time and the US priorities. From 1990 to 1995, we had an average of 112,000 refugees arriving to the United States every year. However, refugee admissions dropped off to fewer than 27,000 in 2002 following the terrorist attacks in 2001. The number trended up since then. The US admitted 84,000 refugees in the fiscal year ending in September 2016, the most in any year during the Obama administration. The fiscal 2016, the highest number of refugees from any nation came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Congo accounted for 16,000 refugees, followed by Syria with 12,000, Burma with 12,000, Iraq with 9,000, and Somalia with 9,000. Over the past decade, the largest number of refugees have come from Burma and from Iraq. There was an article that I put in sort of the recommended list, which is I think from 2010, about the effects of the Iraq war on refugee numbers around the world, not just people who applied to come here as refugees, but all over the world. And I would recommend that you read it. And here you have a good graphic, which is from Pew, of how the numbers vary and where they come from over time. Yes?
I read an article about war versus military people that were hurt versus civilian injuries during any given war or smaller war. And since World War I, the increasing number of civilians that were killed compared to the actual military combatants has grown and grown and grown
Yeah.
astronomically and completely reversed. So you can see where all this recent stuff, they're all related to extreme warlike conditions in countries.
Yeah, I mean, again,
And affecting civilians.
yes, absolutely. And remember that people who are considered to be war criminals, right, they are not accepted as refugees. So in the case of all these wars that have been going on around the world, where, getting back to Carl's question about if something is defined as being a genocide, when you have people running away because of the Rohingya crisis, right? The people who are responsible for that could never apply for refugee status anywhere in the world because they have committed atrocities and have committed war crimes, right? California, Texas, and New York resettled nearly a quarter of all the refugees in the year of 2016, taking together 20,000. Other states that received at least 3,000 refugees included Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, North Carolina, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. By contrast, Arkansas, the District of Columbia, Wyoming, each resettled fewer than 10 refugees. Delaware and Hawaii took no refugees. The U.S. public, as I said, has seldom approved of accepting large numbers of refugees. U.S. public opinion polls from previous decades show Americans have largely opposed admitting large numbers of refugees, which is one of the reasons when we discuss why those quota numbers, right, during World War II were never really used. It was because it was very unpopular. The idea of bringing the displaced people from Europe was highly unpopular at the time. Again, hinging decisions about how to deal with refugees on popular opinion is dangerous because it's never going to be popular. Yes, Mitch.
I'm confused as to what role the states play. Once the federal government says you're a refugee and you're admitted, does each state then have a, could you explain that?
Yes, each state decides who they're going to take and if they're going to take people or not. It's up to the states.
So if there's double criteria, a double screen?
No, it's just you as a state in this country can decide if you are going to accept refugees.
Is there a federal qualification as well, or is it just at the state level?
No, I mean, if you go back to 2016, where there were a number of refugees that had been accepted, and when I say had been accepted, they had gone through the refugee vetting process that took 3.5 to 5 years. They had been accepted to the Office of Refugee Resettlement in this country decides where they negotiate with the states. I think it was 15 refugees from Syria who were placed in Indiana. And when this crisis was happening, they decided to not accept them anymore. And the refugees ended up going to Canada instead. Because many states, because the fear created at the time was such that people decided we're not going to accept refugees in our state.
The Office of
Resettlement of Refugees, ORR, yes.
That's a federal agency. Mm-hmm. They will have a list of people that have been accepted by the federal government as refugees.
They receive the application. Once the applications are accepted, which are done through the State Department, usually they help with the vetting. Then the names are given to the Office of Resettlement, and then the Office of Resettlement negotiates with different states. The refugees don't get to choose where they're going to resettle. A lot of NGOs contribute to that process. Churches usually take a lead in resettling refugees in these countries. Sometimes they are at the front of inviting refugees to their states. So the process is really a negotiation. It's not mandated, right? But if a state says we are not going to welcome refugees, they're not going to welcome the refugees. And then, I mean, finding in the heat of the moment, finding a home for those refugees who had already passed the vetting, right, was very difficult, and that's why they ended up in Canada. Before we end today, although he is not a refugee, I thought that he didn't come here as a refugee. He is a refugee. I thought that the story of Abdi was amazing. He just published a book called Call Me American. I will send you the talk from his book. He also just did another podcast where he gets interviewed about the book. So there is a happy ending to This American Life. He became famous from This American Life. As I said before, this was a challenging conversation. Talking about refugees and refugee law and what they go through is not easy, and looking at the history is also not easy. But I do encourage you, if you want to talk more about immigration, to take the U.S. history of immigration next semester. And I will send you the information about the speaker next week, who is a Mexican journalist. See you then.